Okay, we're going to start talking about sound localization, or how we find where sounds are coming from. So if you remember, at the basilar membrane in the cochlea, that really only encodes frequency and amplitude. And I've already asked this question of, well, how do we figure out timbre? Well, how do we locate sound? This is a really different situation than what we saw with vision, with the eyes and the retina. And I think Goldstein's picture shows that really well, that if the bird is tweeting and it's up high, it's hitting the retina, low on the retina. The cat is down low, mewing, and it's hitting high on the retina, and of course the tree is in between, and that spatial information is really encoded on the retina in that kind of retinotopic map. But we're ending up with a tonotopic map about frequency, and so the ear is not telling us the same kind of information very clearly, that the bird is up high and the cat is down low. And in fact, we have to figure this out in our brains. So for sound localization, we can think of our three-dimensional map of the world that we live in, that there is the azimuth, which is the horizontal from left to right, the elevation, which is our vertical, the up and down, and the distance, which is our depth, how far something is away from us. I'm not going to talk much here about distance at all, as I feel like, well, the authors that I've seen don't talk about distance at all, but I feel like a lot of that is rather top down, and what we know about sounds and how loud or quiet they are and how maybe muffled they are, that we get that kind of distance information. What we're going to talk about are the horizontal plane, so the azimuth, and I'm going to start with that, and then we're going to talk about the vertical plane, so the elevation of sounds. I'm going to start by talking, we're talking about the azimuth, and I'm going to start by talking about these binaural cues to sound localization. Bi meaning two, oral meaning ears, meaning this requires both ears. And I used to, when I first started teaching this class, and I wasn't really concerned about getting through all the material, we actually never talked about maybe touch, pain, taste, and smell, but those have become some of my favorite topics. I used to do this in my class, this kind of quote lab, even though it was really just a demonstration of high frequency sounds, low frequency sounds, and other people with me would walk between the students and make the sound, whether it was a whistle or whatever, and students would try to see where those sounds came from. And just one time in all of those years, I had somebody with no hearing in her left ear, and she did very poorly on everything in the azimuth. So exactly. So this requires both ears, as these are binaural cues to sound localization. We are looking at interoral differences, so differences between the two ears, where we're comparing the information that's coming in from the two ears in those subcortical structures in the brain, so in the superior olive and in the inferior colliculus. So sounds that are off to one side, and I'm pointing off to my right here, but you can kind of do this snapping off to one side and think about the fact that that is going to, if you're doing that with your right arm, your right hand, that's arriving at your right ear earlier than at your left ear, and it's louder in your right ear than in your left ear. So our interoral time difference, so the time difference between the two ears, compares the time of arrival at those two ears. And so if something's at point A, that's going to be hitting my two ears at the same time. And if something's at point B, anywhere off really to the side of A, it's going to hit the, in this case, because they're showing the right ear, it's going to hit the right ear before the left ear. And our ears are sensitive to within microseconds of difference. So now we've talked about milliseconds as thousandths of a second. Microseconds are like a millionth of a second. So we're very sensitive. Our brain is very sensitive at these interoral differences. These are prominent at low frequencies. I really only remember that by starting with the interoral level difference, which I'm going to go through, and then saying these time differences and level differences or intensity differences, they're prominent at different frequencies. So I really work backwards because that isn't something I remember very easily. And this is occurring in the superior olive, and we will see research on this in a little while. So interoral level differences compares the intensity at the two different ears, where something that's happening, like again, if you snap your finger with your right hand, that is louder in your right ear than in your left ear. These are prominent at high frequencies, and this picture is why I work my way backwards, because our head acts as an acoustic shadow for those high frequencies, and this shows it really well, comparing the boat to the little weeds. So if, because we've done this comparison with those waves in the water before, where if in this case the boat is larger and those waves are smaller, what's going to happen when those waves hit that boat is they're going to kind of spread out, and we're not going to see them as clearly on the other side of the boat. It's acting kind of like a shadow, which you might call it that, but our head acts like an acoustic shadow for those high frequency sounds in that kind of way. Whereas if we look at the weeds in the water, those waves, even though they're the same distance apart as the above picture, they are going around those weeds, and so the weeds don't really break apart those waves. And the same with our head for those low frequency sounds. If you can kind of imagine the waveform going over and around our head as we have these low frequency sounds, our head doesn't act as an acoustic shadow in quite the same way. So interoral level differences prominent at high frequencies, interoral time differences prominent at low frequencies. And here's another graphic that shows how those intensity differences are more noticeable for the higher frequencies. As you remember, that low A on the piano is 27.5. We hear down to 20 hertz, but up until even about 100, let's say almost 500 hertz, the intensity differences aren't making a large difference. And then you can see that as we move 10 degrees over to the right, 45 degrees, 90 degrees, so absolutely over to the right of to our right ear, that those intensity differences are for those higher frequencies are getting greater and greater, which we take that information in and calculate that in our brain to say this is coming over, absolutely to our right versus 45 degrees to our right, and so forth. So again, binaural cues requiring both ears for sound localization. On average, people can localize sounds the best, the most accurately, when the sounds are directly in front of them. We get less accurate as we get to the sides and behind our heads. And this picture is just showing somebody, so those little circles on this ball are speakers, and we can see sounds coming from all those different speakers that are all equidistant from the person. We can see where they are closest to pointing to or giving us the correct speaker. And we see people get a bit worse as we get to the sides of the head and behind the head. We also have what's called a cone of confusion. So if you do that snapping over to your right, you'll notice if you move your hand forward a little bit and back a little bit, but it's at a certain level, or then up a little bit. So come to the side straight over 90 degrees, up a little bit and down a little bit. Between those sounds, there is not enough difference between the two ears for us to really be able to tell that those are in different places. And he has a really great picture in your book kind of showing this cone, how that cone of confusion works. So he provides this idea of the cone of confusion really when we have a particular place along the azimuth and differences in elevation, and especially if they're kind of close to each other. To some extent, we answer this with this monaural cue for elevation. So monaural meaning one ear. We just use one ear. We just need one ear to tell us about elevation. And it is a spectral cue. So if you remember I'm not sure I really said this clearly enough, but those different frequencies, when we're talking about the harmonics of a complex tone, that we talk about as the sound spectrum. So we have this spectrum of sound, these different frequencies, and they're going to have a different distribution depending on the exact location, especially what we're going to talk about in elevation. And part of this spectral cue is it depends on the reflections of the PSYC450. Okay, and we're all going to have our own reflections from each other. So what they did in this study that is being shown, the figure on the right, is they put a microphone inside the person's ear and they played these broadband sounds from about 4,000 hertz to about 9,000 hertz. It included all of those sounds. And then they measured what is the amplitude of each of these frequencies. And as you can see, 15 degrees elevation above had the spectral cue that's in blue. So those different frequencies had those different amplitudes. And 15 degrees below, when they played the sound there, they had the spectral cue that's shown in red. So those are the amplitudes for the different frequencies. And it's really quite incredible. We're taking all this information in and we're figuring out the location of sounds in elevation, in the sense of the vertical world. We also have the skull blocks, and so if things get kind of over our heads, that gives us information as well. But a lot of this monaural cue is from the reflections of the PSYC450, creating these unique disruptions in the sound waves. And if you think about it, most of our sounds are made up of multiple frequencies, but it's not just this overall broad spectrum sound. As my voice is probably somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 hertz, maybe getting a little bit lower in some of those frequencies. But if I'm off to one side, you're gonna hear that, and if I'm above you, you're gonna be able to tell as I get a certain amount above or below. So we use this monaural cue for elevation based on the reflections of our PSYC450, and I'm going to show this in a study by Hoffman et al. Where you can see at the very top what they are doing is playing tones at each of those. What they're trying to show is that if you look at the box with those intersections, they're playing tones at those intersections, and that people are pretty good. So the red dots are the estimations. They're a teeny bit off along the azimuth, but they're pretty good at elevation, and for some of those places along the azimuth, they're also very good. And so they test them first, and then they put this clay thing in their ear so that they're really not using the reflections of their PSYC450 at all. And you can see that there's certain holes in it, so it's got its own reflections. And at first, at day 0, they retest them after putting this clay thing in their ear so that they don't have those reflections from the PSYC450. And you can see that they're about the same place along the azimuth, but elevation, they have no idea, and they're just kind of guessing there at the bottom. They have no idea along elevation. I can't really see the days, but I think it's day 5. It's spreading out a little bit. They're getting a little bit better. By day 19, they're pretty close to their original, how they were doing with their own PSYC450. Now with this clay thing in their ear, they're pretty close. And just so you see, after they take the clay out, with their own PSYC450, they're back to normal. So really what was happening with this new clay thing acting as a new PSYC450, they were making new correlations in their brains in order to figure out where sounds were located along the vertical plane. This is fascinating to me, and what this kind of means is, so you could lop off my ear, what is seen of my ear, put on your ear onto my head, right? Or vice versa, cut off your ear, put my ear onto your head. And at first, you might not be able to really tell the elevation of sound very well, but you're going to get better and better, and you're going to kind of create these new correlations for where along the vertical plane those sounds are. So I'm going to tell a little story on myself that's going to show maybe how unempathetic I can be, which I feel like I'm an empathetic person, but sometimes I think I lack thinking through. And I actually thought about this a long time before I asked my colleague. So I had a colleague who fell down a flight of stairs, and she busted up her nose so badly that they had to take the cartilage from her ear to fix her nose. Okay, so it was pretty bad. And of course, I was teaching sensation and perception, and I was wondering. I said, "Well, did you have a little problem for a while locating sounds?" So she said to me, "Well, really, I was in so much pain, and there was so much going on, and there was so much changes. I don't remember at all." Well, that makes sense. It's like, it's a terrible situation, and my scientific kind of curiosity was not very driven by empathy, but so, but yes, I'm sure it did happen that she had problems locating sounds for a little while as they changed her pinna. I think it was just one ear, but still, that's gonna change things. I have a bit of a summary slide here because, and this I'm going to end this one a little bit early because we get into really the physiology of sound localization. So that's a different, kind of seems like a different bunch of concepts that go together. So I'm going to end this here, and just this reminder of, so along the azimuth, we are using those binaural cues, interaural level differences for high frequencies. You can see I have ILD there, ITD for interaural time differences for the lower frequencies. And if you're reading in the field for your project or for whatever reason, you will see that they will use ILD and ITD instead of spelling it all out most of the time. For elevation, we are using, so our particular pinna E and the folds of our pinna E are providing an individualistic spectral cue, which going across the spectrum of sound, those different disruptions in the different frequencies are going to be slightly different from each other, and that tells us about elevation. And it's important to remember that the use of the cues for sound localization is not as accurate as what we get from our retinas, or what the retina is providing us about location, spatial information in the visual world. When we have visual information hitting our retina, that space information, the location, is being maintained in that as part of that retinotopic map. And so one of the things I do at home quite a bit is to do this bird watching. I live out in the country. The birds are pretty. I have lots of trees, and it's really difficult to find the birds. And so I'll be doing this listening. And you'll notice that one of the things we do when we're trying to find where a sound is coming from, to help us to utilize these cues, is we'll move our head around. And so I'm going to recommend that if you haven't already done some bird watching, either do bird watching or find some other way to play this game with yourself of really trying to localize some sound that you cannot see the source of where that sound is coming from. So listening for these cues will get us in the general direction, and but it can be really difficult to find the animal, especially if they're at all camouflaged. But even a brightly colored animal, you really have to point your eyes to the right place to see that animal. So woodpeckers, for me, are particularly difficult to find a lot of the times, and it's not until there's movement, so that visual salience of movement kind of capturing the attention, that you can see, oh, that's exactly where the bird is. Whereas kind of in the ballpark with the sound localization, I can see exactly where the bird is in space once I've gotten the information from the visual world. And I used to show this brain games when, I don't know how often I've even skipped it when we haven't been online, but if you have the Watch This brain games, it's about 50 minutes, and it's got lots of neat visuals and animations, and the scientists come on and speak about different illusions and so forth. But at I think it's the very end, that there is a man who does this clicking sound from his mouth, And then he can localize where different objects are so that he can navigate his world using sound. And he seems like he gets pretty close to how we are with our vision, but still there is one point when he kind of runs into or just telling us, I can't tell if there's a large thing here or two separate things that are close here. So it's not going to be as accurate as our visual localization.